Hi all and welcome to my channel. This is History Calling and today's video marks the first in a series on the 6 wives of Henry VIII. We're going to be looking at the two marriages of Catherine of Aragon, the first to Prince Arthur Tudor, the second to his younger brother Henry, and asking, did Catherine and Arthur, did Henry therefore have grounds to annul his marriage to her because she was his sister-in-law, or did he abandon her for other reasons and commit bigamy by marrying Anne Boleyn? Stay tuned to hear the indiscreet comments Arthur apparently made when he emerged from he and Catherine's bedchamber the morning after the wedding, and what Catherine said to her confessor about the matter over a quarter of a century later. Make sure you stay right to the end too to hear what next week's offering on Anne Boleyn will be about. Please remember to like this video, leave a comment below, and subscribe to my channel with the little notification bell switched on so that YouTube lets you know every time I post new content. You can also follow me over on Instagram where my username is @HistoryCalling. Catherine of Aragon was born in this tower in the Archbishop's Palace of Alcalá de Henares near Madrid on the 16th of December 1485, the daughter of the ultimate 15th century power couple King Ferdinand of Aragon and his wife Queen Isabella of Castile, known jointly as the Catholic Kings. With a pedigree like this, Catherine was a real catch, and Henry VII of England and his wife Elizabeth of York were lucky to secure her in marriage for their eldest son, Arthur, Prince of Wales, who'd been born in September 1486. The marriage would link England to one of the great powers of Europe and bolster the prestige of the fledgling and still quite shaky Tudor dynasty, which had only been founded in 1485 when Henry had seized the crown from his wife's uncle, Richard III, at the Battle of Bosworth. The young couple were betrothed in 1497, married by proxy in 1499 and 1500, and Catherine finally arrived in England on the 2nd of October 1501. She and the 15-year-old Arthur then went through a final marriage ceremony in person in St. Paul's Cathedral on the 14th of November. Afterwards, they spent their wedding night here at Baynard's Castle. As we'll see over the course of this video, what did or didn't happen that evening is still debated to this day. Soon after the wedding celebrations were over, Catherine and Arthur set up home in Ludlow Castle. Unfortunately, their marriage was to be short-lived. Just 4.5 months after it had taken place, they both fell sick with an unknown illness. Catherine recovered, but Arthur did not. He died at Ludlow on the 2nd of April 1502. Dynastically, the loss of the heir to the throne, who had just made a spectacular marriage to a Spanish infanta, was a disaster, but the couple's parents made the best they could of a bad situation. Catherine, now Dowager Princess of Wales, was betrothed to her brother-in-law Henry in June 1503 while negotiations for a dispensation from Pope Julius II in order to allow the marriage to occur were still ongoing. This was necessary because, according to church law in the 16th century, it was illegal to marry one's sibling-in-law, and so a document which dispensed with the rules, thus the name dispensation, was required. The final paperwork came through in 1504, though as we'll see it ultimately muddied the waters rather than clearing them. At this point, however, Henry was still too young to go through with the actual marriage. He'd been born in June 1491 and boys couldn't be properly married until they were at least 14. In the end, thanks in large part to wrangling over Catherine's dowry, the marriage didn't occur during the lifetime of her father-in-law Henry VII. It was only in 1509, 7 weeks after Henry VIII had ascended to the throne, that the pair were married on the 11th of June in Greenwich. Together they were crowned King and Queen in Westminster Abbey on the 24th. Everything seemed perfect. Like Catherine and Arthur's marriage, however, it wasn't to last. Flash forward 20 years. Henry and Catherine are still married, but their marriage has been marred by the deaths of most of their children, and only one girl, Princess Mary, born in 1516, has survived. Catherine is now too old to produce more children, and Henry claims to be having pangs of conscience, saying that his marriage to her was against God's laws due to her status as his sister-in-law. He wants Pope Clement VII to issue an annulment. Of course, what he doesn't openly admit to is his interest in one of Catherine's ladies-in-waiting, Anne Boleyn. The first important thing to understand about the breakdown of Henry and Catherine's marriage is that the commonplace belief that he divorced her is inaccurate. The concept of divorce, whereby each party is free to legally marry again during the lifetime of their former spouse, didn't exist in England at this time and wouldn't do so for another 150 years. Henry wanted to annul his marriage to Catherine, meaning he denied that he had ever been married to her in the first place. The second thing to understand is the theological reasoning Henry used to claim that an annulment was warranted. This was based on his reading of a biblical passage, Leviticus chapter 20, verse 21, which says in the King James Bible, "And if a man shall take his brother's wife, it is an unclean thing. He hath uncovered his brother's nakedness, they shall be childless." Now, of course, Henry and Catherine weren't childless. They had Mary, and there had been many other children besides. They just hadn't survived. Henry, though, decided that what this passage really meant, conveniently for him, was that a brother and sister-in-law would have no surviving sons together. Mary, as a girl, just didn't count. Annoyingly for him, his already dubious reading of this text was complicated further by another biblical quote. This was Deuteronomy chapter 25, verse 5, which states, "If brethren dwell together, and one of them die, and have no child, the wife of the dead shall not marry without unto a stranger. Her husband's brother shall go in unto her, and take her to him to wife, and perform the duty of an husband's brother unto her." This was exactly what Henry had done, and in fact the two passages are quite easy to square with one another. A man shouldn't sleep with his brother's wife while his brother lives, but should take care of and even marry his brother's widow. Henry stayed focused on Leviticus, though, and on his interpretation of it, and tried to say that Deuteronomy was binding only for Jews and in any case referred to ceremonial law. The issue of whether Catherine and Arthur had consummated their marriage would now come to the fore. If they hadn't, then according to Catherine and her supporters, their marriage was not fully valid and the marriage to Henry posed no problems. If they had, Henry could claim that Catherine was undoubtedly Arthur's wife and should never have married him. This is, I think, though, too simplistic a reading of Henry's beliefs and motives. He may actually have believed that Arthur had never fully slept with Catherine, but he wanted rid of her, and his claim was essentially that, whether they had consummated the marriage or not, Catherine was legally married to his brother, and so couldn't be married to him. This obstacle contravened God's laws, according to the king, and so even a pope could not dispense with it. Nevertheless, the annulment would have been much cleaner if Catherine had admitted to having relations with Arthur, or if it could be proved, and it would have allowed the current Pope, Clement VII, to save face when overruling his predecessor Julius II's dispensation. A great deal of time and energy was therefore spent on trying to ascertain what had happened between Catherine and Arthur during their brief marriage. There had actually always been some doubt as to how far things had gone with the Prince and Princess of Wales, and concern over the impediment their relationship would cause to a marriage with Henry. The matter was therefore specifically mentioned within the papal dispensation of 1504. Shortly after Arthur's death, Catherine's lady mistress or governess, Donna Elvira Manuel, had reported to the princess's parents, King Ferdinand and Queen Isabella, that the marriage to Arthur had not been consummated. Henry VII had disagreed on this point, however, and as a result, after some redrafting, the final dispensation hedged its bets. When discussing whether or not the marriage was consummated, it used the Latin word fortans. This translates to either perhaps or as it happens, meaning that the passage in the dispensation can be read in two ways. Either it meant it might have been consummated, or it meant the marriage had, as it happens, been consummated. In 1504, this grey area was meant to keep everyone happy and allow the marriage to proceed. 25 years later, Henry could use it as just one more reason why the dispensation was invalid. In order to establish the validity of Arthur and Catherine's marriage, Henry first turned to his longtime friend, Lord Chancellor Cardinal Thomas Wolsey. Wolsey decided in 1527, however, that the matter was too complicated for him and referred the question to Rome. Under normal circumstances, Pope Clement VII might then have given Henry what he asked for, if not for one almighty snag. Catherine was a Spanish princess, and she had family in some very high places indeed. Her nephew was Charles V, the Holy Roman Emperor, and in 1527 his troops stormed Rome in an incident which became known as the Sack of Rome. This forced the Pope to retreat to Castel di Sant'Angelo, leaving him in essence a prisoner of the Emperor, who wasn't about to allow his aunt's marriage to be dissolved and his cousin Mary to be disinherited. As long as the Pope was under his thumb, there would be no annulment. Henry now changed tack. After a failed attempt in June 1527 to effect what we might call a healthy breakup with Catherine, during which he asked her to live separately from him and she cried, refused to do so, then wrote to her nephew for assistance, Henry requested that the Pope allow a commission to be held in England to decide his great matter, as the annulment was known at that time. Thus, in the autumn of 1528, the Pope's legate, Cardinal Lorenzo Campeggio, arrived from Italy especially for the job. At first, he tried to avoid an open court case, asking Catherine to retreat to a nunnery, which she refused to do. She even made her confession to him and gave him permission to make it public, swearing that she and Arthur had only slept in the same bed 7 times during their brief marriage and that sleeping was all they did. With the King and Queen still at an impasse, the commission finally began in the Dominican Friary of London, better known as the Blackfriars, in late May 1529. At these hearings, witnesses were called who had been with Catherine and Arthur on the night of their wedding and the next morning. Sir Anthony Willoughby, for instance, reported that Arthur had emerged from his wedding chamber with the words, "Willoughby, bring me a cup of ale, for I have been this night in the midst of Spain." Others recalled Arthur saying, "Masters, it is a good pastime to have a wife." Catherine, however, sang a different tune. She came to court on the 21st of June and reiterated her case directly to Henry, falling on her knees in front of him while he, embarrassed by the situation, tried and failed to raise her up. She asked him to consider her honour, her daughter's, and his, that he should not be displeased at her defending it, and should consider the reputation of her nation and relatives who will be seriously offended. In accordance with what she had said about his goodwill, she had throughout appealed to Rome, where it was reasonable that the affair should be determined, as the present place was open to suspicion, and because the cause is already begun at Rome. She then left the court, never to return. On the 23rd of July, Campeggio adjourned the case until October, but in the event renounced his powers as papal legate in September and returned home. The annulment was referred back to the Pope. So what are we to make of all this? Had Arthur lied in 1501? Was Catherine lying in the 1520s? Or were the witnesses called by Henry simply saying what the king wanted to hear? It's impossible to know for sure. Arthur may well have spoken the words that Willoughby and others recalled, but that doesn't mean that he was telling the truth. He could have been showing off to the men around him on the morning after his wedding. Equally, even if the marriage was unconsummated that night, it was several months before the Prince of Wales fell ill, and would he really have neglected to consummate the marriage for all of that time? Or were Willoughby and the other witnesses at the trial lying through their teeth? Was Catherine, for that matter, lying through hers? Queen Catherine has gone down in history as an incredibly pious woman who is unlikely to have lied. Yet she also believed in the power of the Pope to dispense with any impediment to her and Henry's marriage, and she absolutely believed that she was his true wife and that their daughter Mary was legitimate. She even had the Deuteronomy verse to support her in her beliefs. It's conceivable, therefore, that she thought lying about her relationship with Arthur was the lesser of 2 evils if it would enable her to protect her own and her daughter's position and save Henry's soul by preventing him contracting another bigamous marriage. David Starkey even questions whether at 15 and 16 she knew enough about conjugal relations to know what had or hadn't happened with Arthur, and how much would she have really remembered a quarter of a century later about her less than 5 months with a boy she barely knew. Eventually, Henry grew tired of waiting, and he came up with a radical solution to his problem. He broke with the Church in Rome and established the Church of England, with himself as supreme head. Believing, or at least claiming, that he and Catherine had never been married in the first place, he married Anne Boleyn probably in November 1532, with another ceremony in late January 1533. Thomas Wolsey had long since fallen from favour and died in 1530, and so it was the Archbishop of Canterbury, Thomas Cranmer, who declared the marriage to Catherine void on the 23rd of May 1533, and the Boleyn marriage valid 5 days later. Catherine was stripped of her title as Queen, reduced to Princess Dowager of Wales, and forbidden to return to court, having already been banished in 1531. Worse still, due to her refusal to concede that her marriage to Henry was invalid, she was forbidden from seeing their daughter Mary, who had been declared illegitimate. In March 1534, the judgment from Rome finally came through and found in Catherine's favour, stating that her marriage was sound. It was too late. Henry never saw her again, and she died at Kimbleton Castle in January 1536, aged 50. She was buried in Peterborough Cathedral with the honours due only to a Dowager Princess of Wales. History has been kinder to her though, and today she is recognised as a queen at her tomb. So had Catherine consummated the marriage with Arthur, and was Henry VIII the bigamist? It's impossible to know the answer to the first question. If I had to put money on it, I would say that she probably hadn't fully slept with him, based on the fact that even at the time of her widowhood, it was claimed by her female servants that she remained in the same condition she had been when she left Spain. Nor did she fall pregnant by Arthur, which certainly isn't conclusive evidence one way or the other, but it's worth bearing in mind that she did so by Henry on a regular basis in the early years of their marriage. Catherine really was incredibly religious too, and to swear as she had done that she hadn't lain with Arthur when she had would have risked her immortal soul in her eyes. As I've already discussed though, she had good reason to lie as well, and she was ultimately only human, not a saint. She also believed in the power of confession and forgiveness, and may have relied on these to enable her to tell the court an untruth while apologising to God later through her confessor. At a distance of more than a quarter of a century, it's possible that she genuinely didn't remember exactly what had happened and may have been wrong without even realising it. As for Henry's bigamy status, certainly by the laws of the Catholic Church at the time, as laid down by the Pope, he remained married to Catherine until her death, making his marriage to Anne Boleyn invalid and their daughter Elizabeth illegitimate. His interpretation of scripture was also highly dubious, to say the least, to the point that it wouldn't have mattered if his brother had slept with Catherine or not. Leviticus doesn't forbid a man from marrying his brother's widow, and Deuteronomy practically demands it. By modern standards, he would also have been considered a bigamist, as his grounds for annulment wouldn't stand up in a court in England today, though today he could have sought a divorce. Henry made his own laws, though, and his own church, and according to them, his marriage to Catherine was legally over. In fact, it had never even begun. As Catherine had discovered to her cost, when Henry wanted something, he got it, and in his realm, the truth and the law were what he made them. So what do you make of all this? Did Arthur and Catherine consummate their marriage, and was Henry a bigamist? Let me know in the comments section below. If you'd like to know more, I'll leave links to some books, movies and TV shows which present Catherine's story in the description box, and remember to make sure you're subscribed with notifications switched on so that you don't miss next week's video, which will look at the mystery surrounding when Anne Boleyn was born. Till then, keep learning.